Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video and Silicon Curtain co-stream, where I am joined by Jonathan Fink, who is fresh back from Ukraine, and we can't talk about most of what he's experienced, but it's from just having a little conversation, holy moly, interesting things, but we won't talk about it. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. But he has he's been to Ukraine again. As we were there in, I think, late January it was, wasn't it? Delivering some trucks. He's been doing some more trucky stuff and other things. And we're going to be talking to you not about that because basically you can't.
Well, I can say a few words. Just there's certain parts of it I'm sworn to silence, but I can give a general impression. Absolutely.
Well, it's interesting. I've just done a Frontline update, my first one for 11 days, because Jonathan and I went away for a week myself for a family reunion thing. And so I've been out of it, and I did just my hits and losses video every day. And that's broadly what I did, the odd military aid video, but not keeping on top of it as much as I would have otherwise done. And getting back and doing an 11-day update, I can see some fairly significant movements along the front line. In a few places I haven't really seen them. There's talk about gearing up for an offensive in Zaporizhia, with the Russians certainly very active down near Kamyanska, near the Zaporizhia reservoir, as was, and a few other places. Oskil, they're sort of moving across the Oskil River right in the top of the country. There's obviously Kursk, they're still active, pushing the Ukrainians out there and then continuing down to the south. There's areas along the northeastern front where they're pushing, and then an area between Toretsk. I think they're pushing back the Ukrainians in Toretsk again, and an area to the south of Toretsk before you get to Pokrovsk, where they're advancing. But you were just speaking to me in quite positive tones about some of your experiences, defenses being built, which we all know about. The Ukrainians are definitely doing a good job on building defenses there. Is there any, knowing you have to be careful, is there any sentiments you can share?
So let's say we were past not too far from Pokrovsk, and you can certainly see second and third lines of defence taking shape. I think it's well understood that there was quite a bit of scandal, because these defences were supposed to have been built before now, and they were supposed to have been quite extensive. So when the Russians started pushing in towards Pokrovsk and making some of the advances they did earlier this year, there really wasn't anywhere that the Ukrainians could have dug in, and they weren't able to sort of seize strategic points, or they weren't prepared, as it were, to hold certain strategic points because the preparations just weren't there. I think there's been a certain amount of kicking butts, as it were, because clearly a lot of work is now taking place. A lot of work still needs to be done, but these defensive lines are quite a bit behind where the active front is. So I assume there's more work reinforcing closer to the front, but they're also building second, third lines of defense, possibly with a view that the Russians are not going to get much further if they take Pokrovsk, and that's a big if. I think the Ukrainians are determined that they do not push too much further into the country. One thing I did see, and again, this is the bit I'm not going to say too much detail about, but what gave me hope is it certainly seems that the Ukrainian, not just innovations in drone warfare, but the actual infrastructure behind it is considerable, extraordinary, and mind-blowing. And that's kind of all I'm going to say about that. But it did fill me with confidence, seeing how some battalions are really gearing up to become expert at drone warfare on an absolutely industrial scale. And one assumes that from what I saw, which is only one small part of the front, that is happening across multiple points of the front line. And it shows that very little can actually get through. We saw monitors, and I can say this bit because people have taken some screenshots and already posted them on LinkedIn. We, at one point, saw monitors where you could see in a particular sector, I won't say where, but a particular sector, you could see the drones that were in the air, the observation drones. You could see the sort of vampire and killer drones and the FPVs that are taking out, tanks, armored vehicles, individual soldiers. And we were able to witness in real time how every inch of that particular part of the front was monitored. almost an ant couldn't get through without it being picked up on this sort of surveillance. And then very quickly, as in Vietnam, airstrikes are called in, then here Ukrainians would call in sort of drone strikes. So you have Russian armor, nudging forward, trying to push through, find weak spots. And we could see in real time how it was taken out. And then every single individual on that tank, because there are about sort of 6 to 8 people, clinging on to the tank as it crossed the sort of no man's land. We could see how then every single one of those people were taken out. It was vicious, it was unpleasant, it was disturbing. But obviously these are people who've come to Ukrainian lands to kill, rape, steal, and destroy. And every fewer single Russian soldier that remains on Ukraine, that one fewer to cause mayhem and destruction. But so seeing the scale of this new style drone warfare play out, insane is just not the word to describe it, but also gave me hope that Ukraine really are getting their act together.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of this is being bowled over by the technological wizardry that you were seeing, and you were detailing to me that you can't say in public, but it's quite something that what they've been able to do in certain sectors. But of course, the question is, does that kind of experience represent everything that takes place on the front line? And of course, you've got infantry still. Yeah, it's incredibly attritional, but the Russians still seem to be able to push on and take those kilometers and take those hits and take those losses and still keep that momentum going. It just seems to be an endless, they can draw endlessly from this human resource. And I don't know whether there's any sign that they're particularly struggling to get people. I mean, they're always kind of struggling to get people, but then they scrape them together from all of these corners of the globe and all these corners of their society. And they're just able to keep pushing on and get equipment. So I was thinking the other day, because I keep showing how they're using cars and quads and all these kind of crappy vehicles to move from A to B. But if your desired function is something that can move you from A to B, it doesn't really matter what it is. And if it doesn't give you that much protection, the survivability is poor, it doesn't really matter, because you've got enough people to get over that. And so we're still at this position whereby they're doing things fairly desperately, but they're able to do things desperately, and they're still marching on. And the Ukrainians, of course, each one of their people is so valuable compared to the Russians. So we're still at this position where I just don't know.
Jonathan, the cost is intense, because and of course Ukraine has had to innovate this drone warfare, and now it's having to scale it up, precisely because they had a critical manpower shortage. They also had a problem where they couldn't rotate people on the line, and people are there for months on end. It's terrible physically. It increases your chance of mortality or injury. And of course, mentally, it must be terrifying and exhausting. However, it seems that, again, this is entirely anecdotal, but also Institute for Study of War and various other studies are coming out with a similar kind of sentiment. Not only Ukraine has had to innovate the drone warfare to make up for manpower shortages, it's actually being able to do that, and now that is gaining extraordinary scale and momentum. It's carry on growing because they made the investment in it, but it seems that their manpower shortages eased ever so slightly. They're getting more people through the training cycle, through the pipeline. So you could be seeing, as well as digging these defensive fortifications, which are going to be very costly if the Russians try to punch through them. So I think at this point, there's very little likelihood, it seems to me, of Russia, despite being able to pull together the resources month in, month out, the cost of them pushing further and taking substantial territory, I think it doesn't seem reasonable. So when various media sources say, "Oh, Ukraine's going to fall," etc., etc., my bet really would be on Russia falling or failing to be able to muster its resources before Ukraine does. I think we're seeing a bit of a tipping, as it were, of the scales in Ukraine's favor at the moment. And of course, Europe is starting to step up in terms of defense, money, the additional 21 billion that's announced. Yes, it's too slow. It's never at the right scale. It's rarely at the right time. But it does seem that things in my mind, is swinging in Ukraine's favor. The other impression I had on the, visiting these places is the sheer resilience. Ukrainians are not going anywhere. There's an absolute determination to not let Russia get away with its crimes, to not let Russia get away with another foot of Ukrainian territory.
Yeah, the one thing I do worry about, though, is that there's been a bit of a struggle with the Ukrainians in terms of the interception rates of Russian Shahed drones. And so even last night, when you only had 62 drones, I think the Ukrainians have struck a manufacturing facility, and that's why we've seen maybe a third or a quarter, even sometimes, of what the Ukrainians were experiencing like a month ago. So there's been a real dip down in the number of Shahed sent every night, but the percentage of interceptions has gone down as well. And so 62 last night, 11 got through. And we have had times when 22% of drones were getting through, with 150 drones being sent. And so every night, that's a cumulative impact upon Ukraine, upon the psyche, and also the targets that they do hit. We don't know what targets are being hit particularly, and I'm sure there are very many sensitive targets being hit. Then ballistic missiles are starting to get through again, and I'm worried that Ukraine is suffering a long-term attrition, and if they can't get these Patriot interceptors and stuff, Kiev then becomes more vulnerable. So I'm slightly worried about that from the Ukrainian point of view. Did you speak to anyone about nightly attack drone strikes and missile strikes at all?
Of course, going through certain towns where we were, you can see the evidence of that. We went through and saw the actual courtyard of one town where a ballistic missile had hit an apartment building next to a playground. And of course, we know that days later, a playground was actually hit in I think it was Sumy, it was Kryvyi Rih. So we didn't pass through there, but we saw a very similar instance of one of these. You've got apartment buildings all around. You've got an old Soviet-style sort of playground, and we saw the caved-in part of a building where there had been a hit there. So you can see that is having and exacting a terrible toll on civilians. We've got the extraordinary damage committed over the weekend. None of this is strategic, though. First of all, the people are still there. People are not going to leave these areas unless the Russian army are literally on the border of these areas. So what's remarkable is, despite going through a town and seeing, it could be, even quite close to the front, that was the other surprising thing. We always see pictures of shelled up buildings, and then Trump comes up with this phrase, Ukraine is totally destroyed, there's nothing left. Well, here's one town we visited, which is only tens of kilometers from the front line, and I could say that less than 1% of the buildings have been hit. Now, that is still incredibly dramatic and horrifying, but there's shops open, there's kiosks open, there's people driving around, doing what they need to do. Many of these apartment buildings are still inhabited, despite the extraordinary risk. So yes, Russia is getting more drones through, and that obviously is a direct result of the US delivering fewer Patriots and systems, and Europe not being able to sort of step into the breach and fulfill that capacity. Is that going to have any material difference on Ukrainian resilience? Probably not. Is it going to affect the war effort? Well, probably not, actually, because many of the factories are fortified, built in bunkers, reinforced. Even if they're hit, they can take the equipment that's left and occupy another location, even within the same buildings. And it has to be said, there's a strategic choice here, and actually a lot of the defense against Shaheeds and so on are almost certainly at this point going to protect strategic factories and facilities. So the terrifying price that civilians are paying, it's not going to work psychologically, and it's probably not going to have any impact on Ukraine's ability to fight back. That sounds kind of horrifically callous, but that's just a measure of Russia's tactics. They're not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the terrible strike on Sumy the other day that we're now hearing was actually a sort of, I say scare quotes, legitimate target. So the theory is, and according to the local mayor of Konotop, that actually the mayor, I think, of Sumy, or the regional administration head, had organized them. Again, this is like the 5th time this has happened or similar. It happened on both sides, actually, where they'd arranged a kind of medal award ceremony. Troops were accumulating inside the shelter buildings. That information got out to the Russians. The Russians hit with 2 ballistic missiles, but of course, not of course, but the soldiers, if they were there, were actually sheltered, and the ballistic missile hit a bus full of people, for the civilians, and you know the horrors that then took place. And then you're like, well, you know, that's not justified, and we can argue about, you know, what's a justified military target, and then whether you're using the correct missiles to do that, and whether it's responsible for either side to do whatever they did. But you know, this is a war that Russia have started, and you've ended up with a whole bunch of 34 dead Ukrainian civilians, children dead, and there were terrible scenes there. But then, of course, you know, if that was what happened, recriminations then against administrations for trying to do these kind of accumulations of troops, which, you know, is highly controversial. But
Trolls came out with that within minutes of the strike. That version was already being propagated. So,
this is actually coming from but then the Ukrainian mayor of the local town was like, if the regional head doesn't resign or get on his knees and say sorry by 6 o'clock, I'm going to tell you what really happened. And that didn't happen. So then he came out and said, this is what really happened. So take it all with a pinch of salt, but that's coming from the Ukrainians. But it still, for me, doesn't justify that.
No, it doesn't. And we shouldn't give Russia any cover. And that's not what you're doing, obviously. But
no, I've always
Russia knows the price. I mean, they know what's going to happen when you fire ballistic missiles into the center of a town on Palm Friday. They know people are going to be coming to and from church, leaving church on Sunday. Sorry, Palm Sunday. They know exactly the impact. They may hit 1 or 2 servicemen, they may not. The fact is, they don't care. I mean, that should be the narrative. They just don't care.
So then it comes on to what the world response was and what the American response was, because I presume you've taken. You've noticed how Trump replied to the strikes compared to other leaders.
Well, that's what I've called this episode. I've got a picture of Trump being sworn in, and I've called it Traitor in Chief. Why? Because I think he's a traitor to American values. He's a traitor to Ukraine. I mean, there's absolutely no question there. He is appeasing Russia. The phrase he came out with, which I'll, I'd love to hear your reaction, which is that Russia did it by mistake, or he thinks Russia did it by mistake. That indicates to me that he may have spoken to Putin or someone directly and received these narratives. But the question is, well, was that a mistake? Was hitting the children's playground a mistake? Was hitting the children's cancer ward in Kiev a mistake? No, none of these are mistakes. They are all done by design. And Russia is completely, I would say, indifferent to human suffering and casualties of civilians. In fact, they want to maximize it because they want to denude these areas of Ukraine of its population. It's a form of ethnic cleansing. It's not working, but that's the intent behind it. Trump has not only appeased that and created cover for it, he is actively supporting a genocide. He's a traitor to American values. He's a traitor to morality. He's a traitor to liberty. He's a traitor to freedom. I don't know how many more I can put in that list, but essentially he betrays everything that supposedly America stands for, and he will continue to do so as long as he's given up impunity. Russia will continue its slaughter as long as they are allowed to get away with it. I think that it's as simple as that. There's little more to add.
Yeah, so him declaring that it was a mistake as the first reaction, like, oh, it was terrible, but I've heard it, and I heard it was a mistake. Straight away, he's exonerating Putin. There was no, at least with Marco Rubio and Keith Kellogg, they actually, in their tweets, who I think still underplayed it, they at least finally gave some moral evaluation to Russia and some causal implications. In other words, it was that we have to clap them on the back for doing this is bizarre. But well done for saying that Russia sent in a vile attack, sent a missile into Sumy, or missile or two into Sumy, and killed these people. You know, well done for saying what's blatantly obvious. But but actually that we have to say that shows where it's been recently, which is where American politicians have not been allowed to use the word Russia in any kind of way that connects Russia to doing bad war things. Okay, so but then Trump comes along and says, well, it was a mistake. So straight away, that's an exoneration, giving Putin some elbow room, and then really goes straight on in the rest of his answer to saying it was Biden's fault. It was insane. It's like, what? Tell me something about this terrible Sumy missile attack. Well, A, it was a mistake. Poor old Russia made a mistake. Oh well. And then B, it's Biden's fault. It's always Biden's fault. It's like, hang on, Biden's not president. This has been and gone. Let's just worry about solving this now.
And this is the thing, I think, is those who are holding out for him to be serious about peace and negotiating process. No, the only reason he'd want peace in Ukraine is potentially in the longer term for personal benefit or to benefit his inner circle, but in the short term it's to get some kind of kudos. He dreams of getting a Nobel Prize. It is all things that go to him. He's not interested in peace in and of itself. Now that it's becoming clear to many, including some in his circle, that Putin is not serious about peace, it's not that he's doubling down on trying to make it happen. He's losing interest. After all this palaver, he is literally losing interest, and he's going to turn to the next thing. He's going to move on. He's going to stop talking about it.
Well, just to give you another example of losing interest, Gaza, right? So the Israelis are clearing out 20% of Gaza. They're clearing out Rafah, and they're getting on with doing this. So Trump, I think, was responsible for imposing a ceasefire on Israel. This is how I understand it. But then Israel have kind of like pushed the envelope, and while Trump is busy playing golf and then doing trade wars with the rest of the world, they've gone on and continued to do some pretty horrific things in Gaza, from what I can understand. I've not been following that very closely, but the idea that is interesting that what I was reading was actually Trump's got distracted, got bored or whatever, moved on to these other things, and then Israel are able to go and do whatever they're doing. Trump's got bored with Ukraine and Russia. Russia is able to go on and do whatever they're doing. Meanwhile, Ukraine seem to be going, well, hang on, we're not striking energy targets at the moment. So I'm hoping they'll get to a point where Ukraine, because they've been talking about having ballistic missiles, long Neptune missiles, more drones being scaled up. I'm hoping they get to a point where they go, right, okay, Trump, if you really don't give a crap, we're just going to start bombing the feck out of oil refineries and depots again.
And let's take out the Kremlin while we're about it as well. Do something that gets that back into the headlines and that is proportionate with what Russia's doing. No, but certainly Russian energy facilities, pipelines, oil, that all needs to go. I mean, Ukraine cannot count on a genuine peace process because it does not exist. It does not exist because Trump had the leverage, I think, to try and impose one, but is not using any of the levers. I was accused of being a Trump supporter earlier in the year simply because I did a couple of episodes pointing out all the levers that Trump has at his hand. I mean, he could have many times over applied those.
He could have won this war for Ukraine, or
he could have won this war for Ukraine almost immediately by pulling those levers. Yeah, exactly. He didn't. He chose not to. And it's not ignorance of those either. But we're in a place, I think, where Trump does not want to hear anything that he doesn't want to hear. He only wants to hear sycophants and minions telling him what he wants to hear. And if things aren't going his way, he'll just move on. I think this has always been the point. This isn't about rational foreign policy. This is all just the backdrop to Trump world. It's and for him, the headlines, the news, and his name being repeated almost like a mantra, this is what it's all about. And yet people in the media, even experts and analysts, are constantly still looking at it as if this is a regime with any kind of rationality, that this is an American regime that operates on any kind of basis, as if the real world was out there. Now, all of this stuff is just a sort of virtual backdrop to the sort of toddler psychodrama that is now the epicenter, which is the White House.
And I absolutely agree. And I would add to that this is evidenced by, I think, the Trump trade war being like economically insane. ideologically actually fairly, like, there's nothing that's coherent about it, because he keeps flip-flopping, and whenever he gives rationale, I did a video on tariffs last night. He said, right, we're going to do tariffs, no exemptions. Absolutely, we don't need to do exemptions. Then a week later is like, we're going to reduce the tariffs, and then a week later we're going to have exemptions, and it's like, so, and then he sends all his lackeys out to justify his actions, and then a week later they're having to justify not doing what they've just justified doing, and then a week later they're turning themselves into a pretzel by having to justify something else, and none of it's coherent. But of course, going to your point, Jonathan, is this is the thing about the trade war that we need to understand very simplistically. Trump is the center of the news cycle, big time. Like, this is a person who is having the maximal effect on global trade and global events, more so than at any point in history that I can think of. Yeah, the Second World War, you could talk about Hitler in the Second World War, but in 9 weeks, right, Trump has just blown world news apart, inserted himself at the center, and then every news item in the world, every news channel is looking at Trump. The feeling, if you're a narcissist, if you have that as a personality disorder, you are feeding the troll here, big time. That Trump is at the center of everything, and so therefore this is consuming him. And Ukraine and Gaza take a second, play second fiddle.
They absolutely do. And the question then is, if he's not inhabiting the same reality as us, how does he spin all these other people into his orbit? How does the court of King Trump operate? And why do so many people who in other circumstances might almost be, I mean, they're not the sharpest pencils in the pencil case, right? But they might operate in a different fashion in other circumstances.
Marco Rubio.
Marco Rubio, for instance, even, dare I say it, although he was always a little bit clownish, was the mayor character who was Giuliani. In other circumstances, he was a mixed bag, and he was seen to do some things and say some things that are borderline sensible around 9/11. But as soon as they get into the orbit of Trump, it's an utterly corrupting circle. It's utterly decisive. So I just hold the camera up here because the viewers are going to like this.
Oh,
this is
cows, Frisian cows.
Parade of cows coming. I just hope none of them lick me as they're going past. So just in case it calls a drone strike, it shouldn't do in rural Oxfordshire. I'm sitting by a riverside surrounded by cows. They seem pretty purposeful. They're all heading in one direction, so I'll try not to make eye contact. But we're all trying to live in a certain reality, and he's not. He's living in a sort of a narcissistic projection where he wants the world and the headlines and everything to be sort of warped towards him, almost like sort of, the event horizon of a black hole. The irony is that, go back a year or so, I described the Kremlin in the same fashion. The Kremlin also is this extraordinary, black hole effect that almost it sort of distorts and perverts the reality, beyond the Kremlin walls. There, it's the influence of power that's shaping it. Here, we're perhaps looking at something else, which is this narcissistic projection.
Yeah, someone says, Anthony Scaramucci says that Scott Bessant will walk out due to the repercussions in the bond market from the tariffs. It's interesting. I just heard Sebastian Gorka say Scott Bessant really understands the ideology and what's going on. So who knows? But just, it's incredible that people like Marco Rubio are having to say things that are diametrically opposed to what they were saying 5 years ago, 2 years ago, right? And so what is happening, I think, is that you have, and people won't like to admit this, many in America won't like to admit this, but you've got a dictatorship taking hold. You have an autocracy really, I would say blossoming. That's probably the wrong word. You've got the tendrils of autocracy taking root and spreading throughout the land, and it is truly, truly disturbing. What's been going on with the with kicking people out and sending them to the gulag in El Salvador. That's hugely problematic. No due process, refusing to take the guy back that the Supreme Court has demanded that needs to be repatriated. So you're now ignoring the Supreme Court. Therefore, you are ignoring the judiciary. You have got all sorts of stuff going on with people visiting. I was listening to an interview of a guy who was saying, I had palpitations. I visit US all the time. This is the first time I've been at the border. I've had palpitations wondering what I've said about Trump on social media, because we've got account after account after account of people being detained at the border. There was a letter to a newspaper I was reading yesterday that there's a British guy that went on holiday to the US to go on a cruise, £10,000 cruise, and he was detained at the airport, and for X, Y, Z, like spurious reasons, ended up missing a non-refundable cruise, being sent back to the UK. £10,000. You know, this is going to hurt the US in terms of the economy of tourism and whatnot. But
it's already down 35%. I mean, the latest figures are 35% down visitors to the US. That's going to cost the country many, many billions of dollars. You think of all the people who'd be going to not just conferences, but, you know, Disney World and all the rest of it. It's going to lose them a fortune. Is it a surprise? You know, Trump has bankrupted so many of his own businesses. Now he's on the verge of bankrupting Tesla and bankrupting the United States, and maybe even bankrupting the world economy if we let him go that far.
Well, to that end, let's listen to Fiona Hill. So remember, Fiona Hill was on the National Security Council for Trump 1.0. This is what she had to say on Channel 4 News.
We are definitely on a path towards full-on state repression. There's no question about it.
You really think that?
Of course. I've thought this for an extraordinarily long time. This is why I was so outspoken before the election, including in conversations with you, and why so many other people were as well. I mean, there are many academics across the United States who have pointed out about the slippery slope to authoritarianism and autocracy that we're headed towards, making comparisons with other illiberal settings like Hungary and Turkey, for example. There's a whole host of articles being written now about competitive authoritarianism, but there's also a heck of a lot of people in this country who've experienced that directly, including, you know, naturalized citizens, green card holders, who are now finding themselves also being persecuted, and many people who've sought refuge in the United States, who now find themselves being caught up in dragnets in immigration and, you know, summarily dispatched to El Salvador and all kinds of jails, or frankly deported. So look, there are a lot of people who can see what's happening here.
I just thought that was a really frank and honest appraisal of what's going on there from someone that knows this stuff. And I think it's pretty darn scary. And then, you know, so you get these people like Marco Rubio, who I think are towing the party line and having to say things they don't believe in because they're just petrified for their own future in terms of, you know, losing their jobs and being excoriated publicly by the Twitter mobs and whatnot. But then you have someone like Stephen Witkoff, who, I mean, this is a slightly different problem, who, I mean, the good news is that some Republicans have come out. When he had that Tucker Carlson interview, there were some Republicans who contacted Marco Rubio and I think maybe Keith Kellogg or someone else. No, Mike Walls, it was. Marco Rubio and Mike Walls, and complained about Stephen Witkoff because he's just regurgitating Russian talking points on Tucker Carlson. But then he goes to the Kremlin, puts his hand on his heart and meets Putin, and it's all pretty despicable. And then he regurgitates Russian talking points and says, well, the quickest way to end this war is to give away the 4 oblasts to Russia. And you're like, what is going on here? They've just
the quickest way to end it is for everyone to lie down and die. You know, I mean, that's basically what he's saying. Yeah, roll over, curl your toes up, and give in to autocracy. You know, get it over with. That essentially is the strategy there. Are they saying this because they're simply ill-informed and ignorant? No, I think they're also extremely disingenuous, and that gesture of Witkoff, who I believe may be ethnic, you know, he may be ethnic Russian. I don't know how many generations back.
Grandparents on his father's side.
Grandparents on his father's side. He was genuinely humbled and clearly very emotional in his terms, a positive way, to be in the presence of Putin. And I put this in an episode last night. Putin is a killer. He was a selective killer. Now he's a mass murderer. He's moving up the ranks in history of the most amount of blood on his hands. Certainly in the modern era, he ranks, you know, very near the top. He is a vicious, evil man, and I don't know if this is going to get us banned from YouTube. If I was in his presence, I would try to finish him off. I would put my hands around his throat and I would smash his brains out. I would not put my hand on my heart in a gesture of abject humility in his presence and get all teary-eyed about it. This is a vicious monster with no redeeming features. Unfortunately, the US is almost entirely now beholden to Russia. And for those who are saying, yes, well, Putin will cross Trump, Putin will upset him, etc., you just don't get it. What will happen is they will move on, pretend it never happened, and they will construct another reality, another set of talking points on another topic. Maybe even incite a war somewhere else, or do something batshit crazy to deflect from that thing that we talked about. Yeah, but it didn't happen. I mean, my favorite title of a book is by David Satter. It was a long time ago, and it never happened anyway. In Trump world, what happened last week was a long time ago, and it never happened anyway. And unless we start understanding that, we're simply going to be constantly waiting for something rational to happen. Now is the time for Europe to tell America to F off, build their economy with other democracies around the world, arm Ukraine to the teeth, and smash Russia. There's no other way.
Before we get on to Europe, then, the last thing to say on Trump, probably not the last thing I'm going to say on Trump, clearly. But, when you talk about it was a long time ago and it never really happened, the never really happened part, the lying part, is now got to frankly ridiculous levels where he's now come onto national television and just outright lying. So he's talking about, what did he say about egg prices? He said something about egg prices are half of what they were, or some basically just comes on and says, well, egg prices are this, and like, no, they're not. So saying, yeah, they've gone down and blah blah blah, and no, they've gone up and they're crazy prices. It's like, you can't just go on and outright lie about provable facts, but apparently you can. So we are at a stage in the United States where the leader of the country can just go onto television and just and I've talked about this a number of times because this actually got me in the run up to the election where he was just lying at rallies, and now he's doing the same thing. He's just, I can just lie. I can say what I like. Now I wonder whether he's knowingly lying, or whether he's actually being fed by people around him that saying, oh yeah, egg prices have gone down, sir. Yes, they have, sir. Yeah, they've gone down. And he's going, right, thank you very much. And he repeats that. So is that just the people around him know that they can just manipulate him to saying false narratives? I don't know, but the reality is he is smashing our idea of what truth is about and regurgitating BS.
He is. I think it's back to the argument, isn't it, about does he believe what he says? And I think this is almost to sort of treat him as someone who thinks like we do. When we lie, we have a certain consciousness we've lied, and we retain a mirror of reality in our heads, as well as the awareness that we have told a falsehood. That is not how I think this kind of narcissism works. That's not how sociopathy works. I think we talked about it, that I have direct experience of that from a family member. I won't go into details, though. The thing is, when they utter the lie, they might momentarily know that it's an expedient lie, but very quickly that becomes the reality. But that's the reality only so long as it's useful. When it's no longer useful, it doesn't transform into truth or cease being a lie. It is just, that is the thing that I said, and that is the absolute truth at that moment in time, and it's no longer expedient. We'll move on to the next thing. So each new version supplants the last version. There's no memory of some reality there that you hold in your head. It's just a sort of stream of consciousness, which you convince yourself. You invented it. You convince yourself it's the reality, but only so far as it's useful to do so.
Ironically, it's a kind of form of postmodernism that these people most often rail against. It's like, yeah, I've got my own truth. Interestingly, Mark Bisque here says, and thank you so much, Mark, Trump has been a con man for so long that he's even managed to seduce himself into believing his own lies. And that's exactly what Jonathan was just saying. And full agreement there. Thank you for that, matey. So
did you read Sotokov, Jonathan? Just before we go there,
no, I haven't. Mate, I haven't had time to rub my fists together at all, or whatever the saying is.
He's the architect of how you turn what is a sociopathic behavior of this, this stream of consciousness sort of fabrication reality. He's the person who turned it into a political construct and built the mechanisms and how you manipulate and use the media architecture to take advantage of that idea. We'll do an episode when you've had a chance to sort of read up on that stuff. We'll do an episode on it because it's terrifyingly fascinating. Of course, he's come out with a new interview which you should have a look at. And for someone who's postmodern, doesn't believe in any truth, he's got a rather hard, almost completely sort of solid ethno-Russian imperial nationalism that just sort of pokes through. So, it's a postmodern veneer lacquered onto this, hard granite-like Russian imperialism that's never far away from the surface.
Yeah, I'm just looking back to where you mentioned a book that I should read. So send that to me. Oh, there we go. Oh no, that was a different one. Yeah, you have to send that to me again. I can't.
I'll
it might be in
resend
the
it,
signal. Yeah. But yeah. So moving along to Europe, then. I mean, sadly, the coalition of the willing conversations between 30 nations, 200 sort of officials in the military sphere has kind of fallen through. Doesn't seem to be a coalition of willing where we were really hoping that Europe would step up. But instead, there does seem to be a smaller, call it what you will, like a smaller coalition of willing, I guess, where you've got France, UK, a number of other countries. I think the Netherlands has said they're interested recently. I think the Baltics are. Even Japan have been talking about, well, that's to do with training, actually, in Europe, getting involved in training, which is significant. But yeah, so yeah, Europe is at an interesting position where they really need unity. They also need Hungary to sod off. There's a lot of talk at the moment about UK getting close to the EU and I'm not saying this from a Remainer point of view, I want to rejoin the EU, but literally you're starting to get a lot of analysts and a lot of people inside Europe talking about the UK getting closer to the EU. They're even talking about fishing rights, which is always a sticking point in the Brexit negotiations, being back on the table. So if they're talking about that, the UK are looking to get closer, and the EU are looking for the UK to get closer to the EU. That, in my opinion, is a good sign. It's certainly needed in terms of defense. We need to get closer to Europe than we do to the US. But Europe does need to step up, and there is still the situation whereby trying to get unanimity among 27 to 30 countries is going to be difficult. And not everyone's going to want to spend this amount of money, and not everyone thinks that the way to do it is like this rather than like that. And it's herding cats, and it's just going to be very, very difficult. And that's democracy. You're muted.
Muted, trying to find in the glare of the sunlight, trying to find the unmute button. I mean, and of course, there's no real sign yet that they've really dealt with Hungary. Hungary and Orban are making ever more, stronger anti-EU statements, but also by their actions. They're showing they're completely disunited with the idea, not just of a sovereign Europe, but of defending Europe's sovereignty against the imperium next door. I think, if we want that unanimity, they have to find a way to freeze Hungary out of the votes on some of these critical security.
Yeah, but there's an interesting dynamic, Jonathan, there as well, because Peter Magyar who's now the de facto opposition leader in Hungary, his party, is it TIDSA, or something similar to that, they've just released, because Viktor Orban said we're going to release a survey to see whether Ukraine should join the EU. There's already one that I think that was done through the radio that was overwhelmingly in support of Hungarian people supporting Ukraine's accession. Peter Magyar's just had a 1.1 million person survey with I think 58 to 59% of Hungarians agreeing that Ukraine should accede to the EU. So while you're absolutely right, Hungary are being a very difficult member of the EU, he's got to be reading the tea leaves as well. He's got to be seeing that when the 2026 elections come around, he is on the back foot now, and that Peter Magyar is looking like the shoe-in as it stands. Those protests are out on the streets. Like, either you double down and go to full-on authoritarianism, then you're going to be kicked out of the EU more formally, or you have to change the way you're doing things. And I think he'll be stupid. He'd be stupid not to start moving away from Russia, but you know, that's biting the hand that feeds him. So he's in a dilemma.
The question is, you know, as they say, you know, once a member of the KGB, always a member of the KGB. If you have become a Russian shill, one assumes there's a quid pro quo there. There is some benefit you've received, whether it's helping your electoral chances, whether it's helping, you know, the slide of your state into autocracy or eroding democratic institutions, whether it's actual material benefit to you and your family. He won't be doing this stuff just because he believes it. Therefore, one would assume there is no way out. There's no way to turn around and go, do you know what? All that stuff I said about Putin, he's really a kind of bad guy, because you might find out yourself falling out of a very high window from one of the buildings in Budapest. So I think there's no way out for him. The only option is to tone it down and stop making these pronouncements. But of course, again, the quid pro quo demands that when Putin calls you or calls upon you to make those kind of statements, you make them, or you're done. And Putin's not particularly subtle when he does that. You know, he called those favors in from Georgia Dream, almost prompting a revolution, and those protests are still going on. He called those favors in for Yanukovych, and it caused that regime to topple. So Putin's not particularly good, you know, at choosing his moments on when to call the favors in.
Yeah. Just the interesting dynamic is that where Serbia, right, Russia can more overtly control Vucic and Serbia and the ultra-nationalists and whatnot, because they are not in the EU. Hungary is in the EU, and the more they embrace Putin, the more ammunition there is for those in the EU to kick Hungary out. And then, and then they don't get the funding that they so desperately need, because they're net, what's the opposite to contributors?
Net beneficiaries, I guess.
Beneficiaries from the EU, Hungary, and they're one of the most corrupt nations there, of course. And he's done as much as he can to democratically backslide. But you start pushing that even more, you end up getting booted out. And it'd be interesting to see what the EU are doing about that, because we are hearing that they are pretty much at the end of their tether. But then we've been hearing that for a long time. The problem I always state is that if you drop kick Hungary out the EU, then you are just going to throw them into the arms of Russia. You are going to lose them potentially for generations.
You are potentially, but again, you know, at that point they become vulnerable to a full Russian takeover. I'm not sure that many people in Hungary would be particularly delighted to see their country used as a kind of forward base or advanced base for the Russian army. Again, there are risks in going down that course. I mean, Belarus is an interesting example where it is almost entirely a puppet state, but it is not formally absorbed, because taking that last step and having Russia control everything and having Russian tanks on your streets, that's a visual step too far, even for many people in Belarus. It's taking a political risk. That would be even greater, that risk in Hungary. So all these steps come with risk. And I think that's the interesting point here. We had Biden, who was weakly pressing on the windpipe of Putin's regime, but it was having an effect, albeit he could have tightened that grip a lot sooner and a lot harder. And what you see with Trump is a complete loosening of that grip. Nonetheless, is Russia going to get the sort of oxygen it needs to recover in terms of revenues, in terms of support from its allies, in terms of new recruits, etc.? I don't think Russia can pull this back if we support Ukraine to the maximum that's required, given the innovations that are already happening within Ukraine itself. I think you're going to see a kind of appalling stasis throughout this year, but I don't expect to see a huge Russian breakthrough anywhere, and certainly I don't expect to see Ukraine fall. It may be that as the year goes on, the Russian economy teeters further, and this is where Trump is kind of interesting. His lunacy is triggering something perhaps that Putin, not really the master 3D chess player, didn't anticipate. And that is that crushing the global economy, using Trump and potentially China to destroy America. And this is the plan, Rich. Surely this is the plan. Destroy the economy, sour the relationship between China and America, force China to call in the massive debt that it holds, American debt. At some point, they're gonna call that debt. It'll hurt China itself, but it's going to absolutely sort of destroy America having that. This was, I think, Russia's plan all along, but it's gone too far. It's gone too fast. And if the global economy cools, the price of oil drops below that $60 a barrel, maybe possibly even drops even further.
Well, at the moment, Urals are about $49 a barrel. So
$49 a barrel. There we go.
Getting tanked. Yeah.
I mean, Russia's going to be making nothing on that, which really affects its economy big time.
Yeah, this is you beat me to it, because this was going to be my segue, actually. So there's some really interesting dynamics going on with regard to the EU and, say, for example, China. So the trade war that the US has initiated against everyone, you've had a very clever response from Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, who had been, I think, buying up debt in bonds, US debt, and is now been selling it off, and then going and meeting with people in the EU, going and meeting with Japanese people and UK, and then these people working together to sell off US debt and bonds. That then affects the bond market. So that has apparently triggered Trump to go, okay, let's pull back on these tariffs, but to a 10%, and then whack it up to China, which has then meant China has now responded not by backing down, but by going hard. And they've now we're hearing that they're not just putting tariffs on things, but they're stopping selling things like magnets, stuff involved in semiconductors, like the rare earth metals that they have a near monopoly on. This is actually really damaging to the US. They actually need China. So if you're gonna start a trade war with China, be warned that China can kick you in the balls. So China then doing this, and then the EU is doing trade talks with China. So exactly what Russia and China have always wanted, which is tearing the EU away from the US, that has succeeded. And the US has shot themselves. It wasn't Russia and China that did that. It was Trump, a single human being, has done more for the Russian and Chinese objectives than anything else in the history of the last 70 years. Tearing these two entities away, but then you've got the weird dynamic of like the EU potentially getting closer with China, but also saying we don't like Russia. So what there is something that's going to have to take place there. Fascinating stuff. But I mean, there must be people in the Department of Defense and like serious politicians and career civil servants in the US that must be tearing their hair out, going, "What the frick have we become in 9 weeks?"
Well, the American ambassador to Ukraine resigned, I think, last week, and now it's an open question. And of course, that is perhaps something that should have been done by many, many more career US diplomats and officials before now. I mean, I put the question, which a lot of our friends in this fight in America found deeply insulting. I put this in a Signal group several weeks ago, that either soon the choice will be there, either to be complicit or to be part of the resistance. And there are many people who still haven't made that choice. But I think it will become an inevitable choice for everybody of American extraction, whether in country or out of country. You will either be resisting and wanting to reestablish democracy, rebuild democracy from the rubble that Trump has reduced it to, or if you still pretend that this sort of hybrid style autocracy is not happening, if you still pretend the old rules are in place, you are, I'm afraid, sort of complicit in what is happening, because you've got sucked into a version of reality that's no longer there, a normalized version which no longer exists, and pretending that reality is still there is unfortunately makes you complicit in it.
It's incredible that we're getting closer and closer to Alex Garland's vision in his film Civil War that was out relatively recently, where you had a kind of really divided United States, and it was he left it open as to which side was representing what. But I think, you know, there was definitely a Trumpian element to the president who was in charge in that film Civil War. But you're thinking, yeah, that's unrealistic. We'll never get to that point. And then you're thinking, goodness me, we're in a non-election year, and Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders have just got, you know, spoken to 35,000 people there, 20,000 people in Utah, getting 20,000 progressives out in Utah. And you're thinking, okay, there is a movement against this. You are really seeing a very strong division there. But Trump is doing these more authoritarian things and moving the country towards autocracy. And there is this, albeit slow, burning uprising that's taking place. And what frustrates me, and I know that there are other people like, you know, Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell and others who have talked about, well, where are these Republicans who are standing up, who should be standing up much more overtly and saying, hang on, this is not cool. Yeah, you get former Republicans, you get Adam Kinzinger, Liz Cheney and all this, but where are the actual serving Republican congressmen and women standing up and saying, this is insane, this sucks? You hear about like quiet words about Stephen Witkoff, quiet words about this. You know, Ron Bacon's coming out saying, well, the position on Ukraine is bad and blah, blah, blah. But there needs to be far more resilience from within inside the Republicans. And it's not there because that's what it looks like when you have a dictator or a dictator to be.
It's not just Ukraine, is it? It's they're challenging federal law. They're challenging the ability of the judiciary to exercise any form of let's say control or observance of the executive branch. The legislature is completely neutered and is not providing any kind of pushback. And indeed, powers which traditionally rested in the legislature are being fulfilled by the executive, almost rubber stamped. You have the deportations you talked about earlier. I've got a book on my shelf. I've still got it on the shelf actually, because it's quite a disturbing book to have in a spare room when people come to stay. But it's called Hitler's First Victims. I think we have to remember Hitler did not begin by building Auschwitz and huge concentration camps. That regime started with challenging some of the fundamentals of rule of law and actually received quite a lot of pushback, especially from sort of local legislatures and courts. It didn't happen overnight. It was a process of eroding. And of course, there was a first victim. There was a handful of first victims. There were a number of people where they had to test the waters. Can we create spurious charges, arrest Jews, arrest our political opponents? Can we execute them, torture them, murder them? There was a testing of the waters. And when they found they could do these things with impunity and there were no repercussions, then they scaled up dismantling of the systems, scaled up dismantling of all the checks and balances, scaled up the industrial murder process that we're now familiar with. But there were first victims and there were experiments in authoritarianism. We are seeing those experiments unfold now, and they're happening at least as fast, if not faster, than they happened in
by all accounts.
Germany.
Yeah, it's a lot faster. This is sort of tangentially connected to that, Jonathan, but I don't know if you remember. Well, obviously you remember Jeffrey Epstein and the scandal, but just before the election, there was an October surprise where some audio was released of Jeffrey Epstein admitting that he was like best friends, I think, with Donald Trump for like a decade or so. I forget the exact details. And this should have been like really controversial because everyone's been clamoring for the release of the Epstein files. And a lot of people who've been clamoring for those have been Republicans, thinking it's going to implicate loads of people on the Democratic side, people like Bill Clinton, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, it turns out that when they did release the Epstein files like a month ago, I think Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, they redacted loads of it. And then they said we had to do that for national security reasons. And the only reason you would do that is if your president was implicated on that. Really, that's the only national security reasons you would redact that. And they released the files in exactly the same way they'd already been released. There was no new information released. And now they're releasing things like the Martin Luther King, the JFK files, but not the Jeffrey Epstein files, which is fascinating. So then there is this. So talking about, you know, the sorts of things you do, you silence criticism and you get rid of, you put files that implicate your guys in the shredder type thing. Well, this is what we're hearing. So Pam Bondi's Department of Justice has just rejected 4 Freedom of Information Act requests for records tied to Jeffrey Epstein. One of those requests specifically sought documents revealing the identities of Epstein's clients and associates. Judicial Watch also sent 2 separate Freedom of Information Act requests to the FBI. This all comes after Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, claimed in February that the Epstein client list was sitting on her desk. So, without wanting to be too conspiracy theorist about this, it seems very clear to me that Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump were indeed very close. And it would be no surprise to me that there is a bit of a problem with the Jeffrey Epstein files that probably includes implications for Donald Trump. And that is putting people like Pam Bondi in a bit of a sticky position. And then you see, talking about, sorry to bang on here, Jonathan, but then I don't know if you saw the montage that CNN put together of the cabinet meeting the other day, where it went round the table and each of the people said something that was absolutely sickeningly obsequious to Donald Trump, saying, "Oh, it's so wonderful that you're in charge. I love the way you've done this. You're marvelous. You've done the most amazing thing." And it goes on to the next person, Pam Bondi, saying, "Oh, it's such a wonderful blah, blah, blah." And that's exactly the cabinet meeting you would expect in Pyongyang.
Yes, exactly. It's ones which Putin has he's perfected this sort of it only works in a highly sycophantic hierarchical society with no effective opposition, because the minute you inject real opposition into that, it starts to fall apart, and say, hang on a second, the emperor's got no new clothes. But it's worked for Putin almost since the start. He will have a highly scripted sort of thing, or he'll do something somewhere in the country, again highly scripted. Back in the day, one of the classic ones was him diving in the Black Sea, I think it was, or the Aegean or wherever, and finding some archaeological remains. And look what a genius he is. He just dives down once and he finds this ancient amphora, whatever it was. Of course it was placed there in advance. Of course it was all scripted. What he was going to say was scripted. What the expert was going to say to him was scripted. Everything is scripted. Nothing is left to chance. But he'd haul people in, whether it's a regional governor or some kind of intermediary. He'd haul somebody in. He'd absolutely roast them. He'd demonstrate his sort of power and control over them, demonstrate his role in the hierarchy, that everyone is subservient to him. Well, Trump, in his own sort of clownish fashion, is following that similar kind of dumb show court.
Yeah, someone just said about just going on to the Epstein thing. Epstein was best friends with Bill Clinton. I don't know that they were best friends, to be honest. But anyway, they certainly were connected. Trump banned Epstein from all of Trump properties after they found out. I heard, there was an interview with Mark Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein's brother, on Piers Morgan yesterday or the day before. And Mark Epstein said that Epstein dropped Trump when he found out that Trump was a crook. Now, of course, Epstein had his own, I think, crook things going on. And I think all of that, the sex trafficking was a way of getting compromise on people and being able to use that to his advantage. But yeah, if we're to believe Jeffrey Epstein's brother, it was Jeffrey Epstein that dropped Trump when he found out how much of a crook Trump was, which is an interesting implication of Trump's own moral caliber.
There's a lovely comment here from, if I'm not mistaken, that is our friend Axel. And he writes this, if you can see this one here: remember the Saddam Hussein Bath Party meeting that Christopher Hitchens once described? That will be what Trump's meetings become. I don't know if you recall that one. There's a hall of people, and he calls out names, and everybody in the hall knows that the names that are being called out, they're going to be taken out to a truck and probably shot soon after. And only one person answers back, and everybody in the room ignores him. Saddam Hussein ignores him. And in the end, there's nowhere for him to go except leave the hall to certain death. Now, people are going to say this is overly dramatic. And we're not saying it's going to happen in exactly this way. But what Putin has done is he hasn't built Stalinist gulags at the scale that Stalin did. So we're looking at saying, well, he's not a Stalin because he hasn't done that. He's outsourced the Gulag to Donbass. That is the equivalent. It's the killing zone. It's an Orwellian zone of terror, death, impunity, and lawlessness. And it's there in plain sight. Well, Trump will find a way. He doesn't have to build massive, gulags on the territory of the US. I mean, he might do that, but he'll find other ways to do it, as we've seen in the prison in El Salvador. But the trajectory is along that lines. While I've been away, I was thinking of that sort of bingo card of transitional features of authoritarianism and established features. Well, since we last spoke, many more of those boxes on the transitional bingo card have been completed. And hopefully for our next live stream, that'll be ready to share and we can bring it up on the screen. It's truly terrifying to see how many of those transitional features are being fulfilled. And now, of course, you have Steve Bannon, who appeared on a program this week, adamant,
on
absolutely
Bill
adamant,
Maher's Bill Maher's show.
Yeah. Third term. They're going to go for a third term. We've been saying this forever, actually, that was the intent. Of course they're going to go for it, and that takes you much more into the Civil War territory. I think it was the third term that triggered the plot in Civil War, amongst other things. Was it the Western states mounting an army to invade Washington?
Get a load of this. I'm just looking at Julia Davis on Twitter. 42 minutes ago, she said the European Commission is issuing burner phones and basic laptops to some US-bound staff to avoid the risk of espionage, a measure traditionally reserved for trips to China. That's coming from the Financial Times. So that's not just some kind of like. And then Julia Davis is a quote from the article. This is from an EU official. Quote: "The transatlantic alliance is over." Wow.
We knew it, but now finally the statements are catching up with the reality. But the actions have to catch up with that reality as well, because for all these words, there are Ukrainians on the front line right now, losing limbs, losing lives, holding this evil at bay. And for all of the rot that we see in America, I know Vlad and others will say, look, this is a dangerous line to say Russia is responsible for the US electing Trump. And of course, it's Americans that elected Trump. But Russia's been busy injecting petrol into that fire. Russia's been busy injecting funds into the alternative media space, funding extreme left, extreme right, extreme contrarians to destabilize our democracies. Russia has been funding this year after year over the last 2 decades at least. In the 90s, we suspect there was something of a pause while they had their internal chaos. But for 2 decades, they've been using their petro earnings to try to destabilize societies, to place their assets, agents into the system, developing their own techniques to destroy their own checks and balances and institutions, albeit they were very shallow, very weak in Russia. We have to bring Russia into this as well. The chaos we are seeing unfold in the US is partly about I would say the how would you call it, the fragility of US democracy, but it is also about malign actors who want to topple that and have been putting huge resources and efforts into toppling it. So we have to study the malign influence of our adversaries. This is the point that if we don't fight back, who knows where this is going to go next. But certainly I'd say the Baltics are at risk. Certainly the European Union itself is at risk. And certainly other democratic players around the world are at risk from Russian interference and corruption and aggression.
Absolutely, fully agree. Well, look, let's do a few thanks for people who have donated to the streams, to the channels. Petra Olsson for you, some Swedish love for you, Jonathan. Thank you for what you do. Go Ukraine. So thank you, Petra Olsson. That's very, very kind. Kevin Forst for me. Thank you for 5 ATP Geopolitics memberships. Super generous. Thanks, Kevin. Always a great support of the channel. Johnny Christensen with some Danish love. Thanks, buddy. Really appreciate that. And we have also Daryl Thomas with a super sticker. Thank you very much, Daryl. Thanks for hanging out. Most appreciated. And Mark Bisque, as ever, we said we talked about your comment previously, but thank you so much for your support. I need to get on and finish my video recount of visiting Ukraine the first time around in February 2024, because I need to recount the meeting of myself, Greg, and Zhenya and Pierre with Mark's wife, Olena, her parents who live near Kherson, and we visited them. It was absolutely wonderful. So
wonderful people. Absolutely brilliant people. Another little announcement here. We've still got the fundraiser for trucks. So if people look at the description of this video on my channel, we've still got the Easter campaign.
I've been so bad at talking about that.
I've been pretty bad about that one, and hence the donations are quite flat as well. But you know, my head's getting back into this with Easter holidays as well as the travel recently. So yeah, we need to get back on that. I don't see where I am. Oh, 4K. So I'm sort of almost at the halfway point, but we need to kind of push that. The other one is snap announcement. We are running an event on Friday in the Ukrainian Social Club, which is in North London. Yeah. We've got a stellar cast here of Cormac Smith, who's a very strong voice, who you'd be aware of. We've got Edward Hunter Christie, one of the most hard-hitting, geopolitical analysts, and we've got Francis
loved my
Durnley.
interview with him. Yeah.
Oh, he's
from Ukraine.
And we've got Francis Durnley, Ukraine the latest. So it is a bit of a male panel. If there are any female experts listening to this, or if anyone recommends, we really want to get a Ukrainian, especially Ukrainian/female, as a fourth member of the panel. But those are 3 confirmed members. 7 o'clock, Ukrainian Social Club. Come and drink Ukrainian beer. Listen to world-class discussion. This event's going to be called Europe on Fire, and we're going to be talking about how Europe needs to be defended and what we need in order to do that. I'll put all the details on my channel. I'll be posted later on the community post. But if anyone is interested, North London, Friday evening, unmissable event.
Marvelous. Well, you are indefatigable, should I say? So good stuff. Well, look. I guess we better shoot off now. Otherwise, we could talk forever, Jonathan. I know there's so much to talk about. There's too much birdsong around you. I think you're probably going to be pecked to death if we don't let you go. Any last thoughts about what's going on in the crazy world that we live in? You're breaking up. For me, that you completely broke up. Then you might have to start saying that again. I've lost you. I don't know if other people have.
I'm back.
You're back. You're back now. So sort of back. It's all breaking up for me. Yep. Okay. Say what you had to say again. No, all I can hear is birdsong. I might have to say goodbye on your behalf at the moment, Jonathan. I think there's some definite sound issues coming from your end. But nonetheless, I will go and do that. Stay on the line though, Jonathan, and we'll see if you can hear me just after. Thank you very much to all the people in the live chat. Your presence here is supremely appreciated. Thanks for those who supported both the channels. We really do appreciate it. It allows us to keep the lights on. And Jonathan does look back with us. He's now moving, so his video feed is working.
I look back now.
All right.
That was a gaggle of ducks came to peck me to death. I had to shoo them away. No, I mean, on the one hand, I'm positive that Ukraine is not going to fall imminently. On the other, a painful awareness that while Europe dithers, while we delay, while we endlessly debate, Ukrainian blood is being spilt, and it's inexcusable, and it cannot go on forever. And we can no longer rely on the US to be any part of the solution. I mean, any part of the solution. So we better get on with it, I think.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Of course, as accurate as that is, it opens up a whole plethora of challenges and quite how we get on and do it, given the economic hardships that many countries are facing, and given China and this is a complicated time that we're living in, but we do have to do as much as we possibly can as the European Union, as allies, as Japan and Australia and New Zealand, and even countries like China and India play their part in fulfilling the requirements of secondary sanctions, which I think have been incredibly important. But I don't know how much the US is now following up on their sanctioning, which is a real challenge going forward. But anyway, well said, Jonathan. Thank you very much to everyone. And I guess the last thing to say, my good man, is Slava Ukraini.
Heroim Slava, Smert Varagam. And may Ukraine be victorious, and may the Russian Empire finally fall. That was one for our next one. Next time, remember, our next live stream later in the week, we need to talk about Vladimir Karamurza and his absolutely obscenely ludicrous, shameless, awful comment that he recently made in French to the French sort of Parliament or Congress or Senate or whatever it is. Remind me to bring that one up. We can talk about Surkov and Russian opposition. I think that would be.
I saw that, but I didn't read it, so I don't know what he said. But I didn't have time. Yeah, I need to look into that.
It's one you need to kind of absorb, mull over, but I think you'll probably find it as disgusting as I found it. And it's certainly one to explore. Probably we should get some stats to hand to dispel it as well. It's one of those things where it's like, I know this is disgusting, but I really need to have the evidence at hand to be able to refute it. So let's do that later in the week.
Sounds good. Well, look, I'm off to Hamilton tonight. Not the town in New Zealand, but it's actually touring at the moment. The Lin-Manuel Miranda musical of the founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton. So hopefully that will be enjoyable. It's something I've wanted to see. But yeah, in the meantime, matey and peeps, take care, and we shall speak soon. And just the last big love out to BTC Bandit, who's thrown in a last-minute super sticker. So thank you very much to you, my good man, or woman, or definitely looks, like a man. So cheers, BTC. Take care, everybody. Speak soon.
Next time. Thanks, Jonathan.